She wrote, "You're so vain," and the world spent 50 years trying to figure out who it was about. She wrote, "Nobody does it better," and an entire generation decided she meant it literally. She won an Academy Award, 2 Grammys, and the permanent adoration of tens of millions of people who grew up on her voice. A voice that sounded like it had seen things, felt things, understood things that most people spend a lifetime trying to put into words. Carly Simon, the daughter of a publishing empire, the wife of a folk legend, the singer who became the sound of an era. And then, 8 years ago, she disappeared. Not dramatically, not with an announcement, not with a scandal that would keep the entertainment pages busy for months. She simply stopped appearing. No tours, no albums, no interviews, no red carpets. The woman who had soundtracked a generation of American life became, quietly and without explanation, invisible. And the world noticed, and the world wondered. And until this morning, the world did not know why. But today, on the 27th of July, 2026, Carly Simon broke her silence. And she did it the way she has always done everything. With grace, with honesty, and with words that feel less like a press statement and more like a letter from a very old friend who owes you the truth. She wrote, "I have not stopped living, and I have not stopped working." 8 words, and behind those 8 words, a diagnosis that changed everything, a surgery that left its mark, and an album recorded in the middle of all of it. An album called Comes in Waves, an album that arrives in 3 weeks. Not glamorous, but extraordinary. Not a comeback, but a testimony. Here is what happened to Carly Simon, and here is what she did about it. If the voice of Carly Simon has ever moved you, if You're So Vain ever made you laugh at someone you once loved, if Nobody Does It Better ever played on a summer evening you still think about, hit like as tribute to one of the most enduring voices in American music. Because what she is about to tell you is not a story of defeat. It is not a story of a legend diminished by time. It is something rarer and harder and more beautiful than either of those things. It is a story of a woman at 81 who looked at everything the world and her own body had thrown at her, and wrote an album anyway. And it begins, as all truly remarkable stories do, not in the spotlight, but long before it was ever turned on. There is a particular kind of courage that has nothing to do with stages or spotlights or standing ovations. It is not the courage of performing in front of 50,000 people, though Carly Simon has done that. It is not the courage of writing a song so personal and so pointed that the world spends half a century debating its subject, though she has done that too. It is a quieter courage, a more private one, the courage of sitting down on a morning when the words do not come easily, when the body does not cooperate the way it once did, when the face in the mirror carries the evidence of things you would rather not explain, and deciding that the people who love you deserve the truth. That is what Carly Simon did this morning. On the 27th of July, 2026, she published a statement, and it was not a press release written by a publicist in careful, legally reviewed language designed to minimize damage and maximize sympathy. It read like Carly Simon. It sounded like her. It had her rhythm, her wit, her particular way of turning a phrase that makes you feel she is speaking directly to you, and only you, across whatever distance separates you. She wrote, "So many people have written to me kindly wondering about my relative silence, asking how I am and what I have been doing." Relative silence. That is the phrase she chose. Not disappearance. Not absence. Relative silence, as if she had simply turned the volume down slightly, stepped back from the edge of the stage for a moment, and the world, in its eagerness, had simply leaned in closer, trying to hear. She continued, "The truth is, I've been learning how to live with Parkinson's disease. It has taken me some time to understand the diagnosis, to adjust to it, and to decide how much I wanted to say about it publicly. 8 years. 8 years of adjusting. 8 years of understanding. 8 years of deciding." And what she decided, finally, on this particular morning, in this particular summer, is that she is ready. Ready to say it plainly. Ready to name it. Ready to offer the explanation that her audience has been waiting for with the patience of people who genuinely love someone and are willing to wait as long as necessary for news of them. But the statement did not end with a diagnosis. It did not end with a medical update and a request for privacy and a thank you for your support. It ended with something else entirely. It ended with an announcement. Comes in waves. A new album. The first collection of entirely new material in nearly 20 years. Out on the 14th of August, 2026. 3 weeks from today. She did not disappear. She was working. To understand what Carly Simon carried into that silence, and what she carried out of it, you have to go back. Not to the studios where she recorded the songs, not to the stages where she performed them, not even to the marriages and the heartbreaks and the personal cost of a life lived at full volume in full public view. You have to go back further than all of that. You have to go back to a brownstone in New York City in the summer of 1945, to a family that was already, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. And to a little girl who grew up inside that extraordinariness feeling, somehow, that she did not quite belong to it. Carly Elizabeth Simon was born on the 25th of June, 1945. She was the third of 4 children, and her parents were not ordinary people. Her father was Richard Simon, co-founder, alongside Max Schuster, of Simon and Schuster, one of the most powerful publishing houses in American history. The man who built an empire on words, who understood, before most people did, that stories were not a luxury but a necessity, that the human need to read, to be read to find yourself inside someone else's sentences, was as fundamental as any other hunger. Richard Simon was brilliant, cultured, and by many accounts emotionally complex in the way that brilliant, cultured men of that generation often were. A man whose capacity for warmth and whose capacity for distance existed in close and sometimes painful proximity to each other. Her mother was Andrea Heinemann Simon, a woman of equal distinction, though the world took longer to notice. Andrea was a civil rights activist at a time when that required genuine courage, not merely moral convenience. She was also a singer, a woman who carried music inside her the way some people carry light, naturally and without effort, as though it had always been there and could not be removed. It was from Andrea that the Simon children inherited their musicality. It was from Richard that they inherited their relationship with language, with story, with the particular belief that what you make with your mind and your hands and your voice is worth making carefully. They grew up between 2 worlds. The family home in New York City was a place of extraordinary cultural richness. Artists, writers, musicians passing through, conversations that ranged across literature and politics and music and ideas. And then there was Martha's Vineyard, the island off the coast of Massachusetts that the Simon family made their summer home, and that Carly would eventually make her permanent one, a place of salt air and quiet water, and long evenings that seemed designed specifically for the kind of introspection that produces songs. She was not the only talented child in that house. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Carly Simon's early life. That she grew up surrounded by siblings who were, by any external measure, exceptional. Her sister Lucy Simon became a celebrated composer, her work finding its fullest expression on Broadway. Her musical intelligence recognized and rewarded by a world that does not hand out those recognitions easily. Her sister, Joanna Simon, became a soprano of genuine accomplishment. A classical voice that carried the kind of authority you cannot manufacture, only develop over decades of discipline and commitment. And Carly, in the middle of all that talent, found her own path, not without difficulty. Not without the particular self-doubt that can flourish, paradoxically, in an environment of high achievement, where excellence is the baseline and anything less feels insufficient. She has spoken over the years about a stutter that plagued her childhood, about the way words that lived comfortably inside her head would sometimes refuse to come out of her mouth with the ease she wanted. And there is something quietly poetic about that. About the woman who would go on to write some of the most precisely observed lyrics in popular music, spending her early years in an effortful, sometimes painful negotiation with the act of speaking. She found the negotiation's resolution in singing. Because singing, as she discovered, did not stutter. The music carried the words forward in a way that ordinary speech sometimes would not. And so music became, for Carly Simon, not just an artistic interest, but something closer to a lifeline. The form through which she could say everything she needed to say, at the pace and pitch and precision that she needed to say it. She was not born famous. She was born into a family that understood what fame was, what it cost, and what it required. And then she went out and built her own version of it, on her own terms, with her own voice. That voice would eventually reach everywhere. But first, it had to find itself. And finding it, as finding anything real always does, took time and work and the particular kind of stubborn hopefulness that you either have or you do not. Carly Simon had it. She has always had it. The question, the one that this story will keep returning to, is this. What does a woman like that do when the voice that saved her and the body that carried it begin to ask more of her than she ever expected to give? There are artists who become famous, and then there are artists who become mythological. The difference is not talent. The world is full of talented people who never cross that particular threshold. The difference is not even hard work, though hard work is always part of it. The difference is something harder to name and impossible to manufacture. It is the quality of arriving at exactly the right moment with exactly the right thing to say, and saying it in a way that makes every person who hears it feel that you said it specifically for them, about them, because of them. Carly Simon crossed that threshold in 1971, and once she crossed it, she never came back. Her debut album arrived that year. Anticipation followed shortly after. A song written, as the story goes, in the 15 minutes she spent waiting for Cat Stevens to pick her up for a date. 15 minutes. One of the most immediately recognizable opening lines in the history of popular music, written in the time it takes most people to decide what to have for dinner. That is not craft alone. That is something else. That is the particular alchemy of a person who has spent so long carrying words inside them, arranging and rearranging them in the private studio of their own mind, that when the moment comes, the song arrives almost fully formed, as if it had been waiting, not for inspiration, but simply for permission to exist. But it was 1972 that changed everything. It was 1972 that transformed Carly Simon from a celebrated singer-songwriter into a permanent fixture of the American cultural imagination. Because 1972 was the year she released You're So Vain. 54 years later, the debate about its subject has not been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. She confirmed, eventually, that the second verse was about Warren Beatty, and Beatty, in a moment of extraordinary self-awareness, or perhaps extraordinary vanity, confirmed that he deserved it. But the other verses remain, by Carly Simon's deliberate design, unattributed. And that ambiguity, that carefully maintained mystery at the center of one of the most famous songs ever written, has given it a life that most songs can only dream of. It is not just a song about a specific person, it is a song about a type of person, about the particular damage done by people who are in love not with you, but with the version of themselves they see reflected in your adoration. Every person who has ever loved someone like that has heard "You're So Vain" and felt, with a shock of recognition so strong it is almost physical, that Carly Simon wrote it about the person they were thinking of. That is what mythological sounds like. The same year the song was released, Carly Simon married James Taylor. And if "You're So Vain" was mythological, the marriage was something else, something rarer and more complicated, and ultimately more human. James Taylor was not a vain man. He was a profoundly gifted one, struggling, as he has always been open about, with the weight of his own interior life. And Carly Simon was not a woman who loved carelessly. She loved the way she wrote, with full commitment, full attention, full exposure. They were, by any external measure, one of the great couples of American music. Two extraordinary voices, two extraordinary imaginations, building a life together in the years when both of them were at the height of their creative powers. They had two children, Sarah Maria Taylor, born in 1974, Benjamin Simon Taylor, born in 1977, who would grow up to become a musician himself, carrying forward a musical inheritance that would be remarkable even if his parents had been ordinary people, which they emphatically were not. And then, in 1983, it ended. She said, years later, with the kind of precision that only comes from having spent a very long time understanding something painful, "It was the saddest thing. He was the love of my life." 6 words of clarification followed by 5 words of devastation. He was the love of my life. Past tense. The saddest kind of sentence, not because it describes loss, but because it describes a loss that the speaker has clearly made peace with, and the making of peace with something like that is its own kind of heartbreak to witness. But Carly Simon did not stop. She has never stopped. In 1977, she recorded "Nobody Does It Better" for the James Bond film The Spy Who Loved Me. A song so perfectly constructed, so precisely calibrated in its mixture of desire and irony and genuine feeling, that it remains, nearly 50 years later, the standard against which every subsequent Bond theme is measured. In 1988, she wrote and recorded "Let the River Run" for the film Working Girl, and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences gave her the Oscar for Best Original Song. The Grammy voters gave her 2 of their own, across a career that spanned decades and refused, at every point, to settle into predictability. She married again in 1987, the writer Jim Hart. That marriage lasted 20 years and ended in 2007. And through both marriages, through the divorces, through the children growing up, and the decades passing and the musical landscape changing around her in ways she could not have predicted when she first picked up a guitar in that New York brownstone, Carly Simon kept writing, kept recording, kept finding, in the act of making music, the thing she had first found there as a child with a stutter and too many words inside her and no reliable way to get them out. She was not just a singer who had good years and quiet years. She was a songwriter who understood that the work itself, the sitting down, the finding the melody, The putting the word in the right place next to the right other word was not separate from her life. It was her life. The processing and the producing were the same activity, and that understanding that the song is not what you make after you have lived something, but how you live it, would prove, in the years to come, to be not just a creative philosophy, but a survival strategy. Because the years to come were going to ask a great deal of her. More, perhaps, than any song had prepared her for. There is a particular kind of absence that the public finds difficult to forgive. Not the absence of someone who announces their retirement and steps back with ceremony and gratitude and a farewell tour that sells out in 45 minutes. That kind of absence is legible. It has a shape and a reason and a beginning and an end that everyone can locate on a timeline. The absence that unsettles people, that generates speculation and concern, and the particular low-grade anxiety of not knowing, is the other kind, the gradual kind, the kind where someone who has always been present simply, incrementally, stops being present. No announcement, no explanation, no farewell, just less, and then almost nothing at all. That is the absence Carly Simon gave the world beginning in the spring of 2018. Her last public performance was in March of that year. She appeared, she sang, she was herself. And then, without anyone quite realizing it was happening, she was gone. The social media accounts went quiet. The interviews stopped. The tour dates that never materialized were not explained. The album that fans had been anticipating did not arrive. And the world, which had been following Carly Simon for more than 5 decades, found itself in the unusual and disorienting position of simply not knowing. Speculation filled the silence, as speculation always does. Some assumed age. She was in her early 70s when the withdrawal began. And the entertainment industry has always been impatient with age, always quick to assume that a woman past a certain birthday has simply run out of things to say. Some assumed personal difficulty of one kind or another. Some simply waited, with the patient loyalty of people who have loved an artist long enough to understand that artists are not machines, that creativity has seasons, that the silence before a record is sometimes as important as the record itself. None of them knew the truth, and the truth was considerably more difficult than any of the speculation. Inside the silence, Carly Simon was facing 2 separate and simultaneous medical realities, each demanding its own adjustment, its own grieving, its own slow negotiation between the person she had always been and the person she was being asked to become. The first was the diagnosis she received after an extensive evaluation at the Mayo Clinic: Parkinson's disease, a condition that most people associate immediately and almost exclusively with tremors, with the visible physical manifestation of a nervous system under siege, the shaking hands and the altered gait, and the particular stillness that comes from a body working very hard to manage something it can no longer manage easily. And Parkinson's is all of those things, but it is also, as Carly Simon described with a clarity and specificity that stopped everyone who read it, something far more interior than tremors. Something that operates not just on the body, but on the mind, on the will, on the invisible machinery that connects intention to action, desire to movement, the idea of doing something to the actual doing of it. She described it with a metaphor so precise and so strange and so exactly right that it has already been quoted everywhere today and will continue to be quoted for a very long time. She wrote about apathy, about the particular quality of Parkinson's-related apathy that is unlike ordinary tiredness and unlike ordinary sadness and unlike anything that can be easily explained to someone who has not experienced it. She wrote, You can find yourself lying there like a starfish drying in the sun, arms pointing in all directions, while nothing inside is telling you to get up, read, watch, write, sing, call someone, or do much of anything at all. A starfish drying in the sun. That image, the helplessness of it, the strangeness of it, the way it captures something that is happening inside the mind rather than just the body, is the image of a writer, a real one, someone who does not reach for the obvious word or the convenient metaphor, but keeps searching until she finds the one that is actually true. And the truth she found is this: Parkinson's apathy is not laziness. It is not depression in the ordinary sense. It is not a failure of will or character or motivation. It is a neurological event. The part of the brain that issues invitations, her phrase, and it is magnificent, the part of the brain that sends out invitations to participate in life had, temporarily, lost its address book. Lost its address book. She is 81 years old, and she is still writing sentences like that, in a statement about her own illness, on a Tuesday morning. The second diagnosis arrived alongside the first, as if the universe had decided that one challenge was insufficient. Basal cell carcinoma, skin cancer, on her face. The most common form of skin cancer, and in most cases, including hers, treatable. The cancer was removed surgically. That is the medical fact, and it is a good one. But surgical removal is not without consequence. The procedure left its mark. And Carly Simon, who has always been, by her own frank and self-aware admission, more critical of her appearance than anyone else could possibly imagine, she noted, with the particular wit of someone who understands the irony fully and chooses to name it rather than ignore it, "Check out the irony," she wrote, "of having written 'You're so vain.'" Found that the surgery gave her inner critic quite a lot of new material. That line is everything. That line is Carly Simon in a single sentence. The willingness to be honest about the vanity while simultaneously laughing at it. The ability to hold the pain and the humor in the same hand without dropping either one. Between the Parkinson's and its cognitive and emotional effects. Between the surgery and its visible aftermath. Between the mobility challenges and the exhaustion and the apathy that made ordinary days feel like expeditions that required more equipment than she had available. Withdrawing from public view was, as she described it, the most palatable reaction. And then she offered one more image, one more piece of Carly Simon prose that lands exactly where it is aimed. She wrote, "If a person is allowed to hibernate during both winter and summer, then I have become an all-season bear. An all-season bear. Hibernating not just through the cold months, but through all of them. Through the seasons that are supposed to bring people back out into the world, the warmth, the light, the social pull of summer, and the fresh start energy of spring. Through all of it. Withdrawn, quiet, present only to herself and to the people closest to her. 8 years. And here is what the world did not know. Here is the thing that the statement revealed, tucked quietly between the medical disclosures and the self-aware humor and the starfish and the bear. The thing that changes the entire texture of those 8 years in retrospect. She was not dormant. She was not simply enduring. She was not lying still, waiting for the illness to run its course or the silence to lift on its own. She was working. Through all of it. In the days when the apathy was manageable. In the hours when the body cooperated. In the small windows of clarity and energy and creative willingness that Parkinson's had not yet taken from her. And that she had apparently learned, with the methodical patience of someone who has been making music for 60 years, to use. She was building something. And what she built, what an 81-year-old woman with Parkinson's disease and a surgery on her face, and 8 years of public silence built in the room where she did not have to leave in order to go somewhere, is the question that carries us into the most important part of this story. What does "comes in waves" sound like? What does it mean? And what does it tell us about who Carly Simon is, at 81, after everything? There is a version of this story that writes itself easily, the version where illness is the villain, and recovery is the hero, and the new album is the triumphant final act that proves the villain was defeated. That version is clean and satisfying, and emotionally legible and almost entirely false. Carly Simon did not write that version. She is too honest a writer to reach for the comfortable arc when the true one is more complicated and, ultimately, more interesting. Because the true version of this story does not end with the Parkinsons defeated. It does not end with a cure or a remission or a declaration of victory over a nervous system that decided, somewhere in the years after 2018, to begin operating by different rules than the ones she had always known. The true version ends, or rather, does not end, because it is still happening, with something quieter and more difficult and more genuinely inspiring than triumph. It ends with accommodation, with the hard, unglamorous daily work of learning to live inside a life that has changed shape, and finding, inside that reshaped life, the things that still matter, and the ways they can still be done. That is what "Comes in Waves" is. Not a victory lap, a testimony. To understand what it cost to make it, you have to understand what Parkinson's disease actually does. Not in the simplified version that most people carry in their heads, but in the full, specific Carly Simon version that she described this morning with the precision of someone who has spent years studying the thing that is happening to her body, because understanding it was the only way to stop being entirely at its mercy. The Mayo Clinic evaluation was extensive. The diagnosis was careful and thorough, and arrived, as major diagnoses always do, with the particular weight of something that cannot be taken back. Parkinson's disease is a progressive neurological condition. It affects the dopamine-producing neurons in the brain, the cells responsible for smooth, coordinated movement, yes, but also for motivation, for pleasure, for the neurochemical architecture of feeling that something is worth doing. When those neurons are compromised, the effects are not limited to the visible tremors that most people associate with the condition. They extend inward, into mood, into energy, into the invisible motivational machinery that gets a person out of bed in the morning and keeps them moving through the hours of the day with some sense of purpose and direction. Carly Simon named those interior effects with the directness of someone who has decided that the shame of being seen struggling is considerably less damaging than the isolation of struggling unseen. She named the anxiety. She named the exhaustion. She named the depression that Parkinson's can bring, not as a response to the diagnosis, but as a neurological symptom of the disease itself, a chemical event, rather than an emotional one, which is a distinction that matters enormously and that gets lost almost every time Parkinson's is discussed in public. And she named the apathy, the starfish, the lost address book. But here is the thing about Carly Simon that the starfish image does not fully capture, because the starfish image is about stillness, and what she actually did was the opposite of still, even in the days when the apathy was strongest, even in the weeks when the address book was most thoroughly lost, even in the long stretches of the 8 years when getting up and doing anything at all required a negotiation with her own nervous system that most people will never have to conduct. Even then, she was finding her way back to the music. Not consistently. Not heroically. Not in the way that inspirational stories about artists overcoming illness tend to describe the creative process, as if the muse arrives on schedule regardless of what the body is doing, as if great art is made through willpower alone, and the body is just an inconvenient vessel that the truly dedicated artist learns to ignore. It was nothing like that. It was more honest than that, and more human. It was melodies written down on days when the writing was possible, tucked away for the days when it was not. It was verses completed in pieces, ideas captured when they arrived and held carefully until the capacity to develop them returned. She described it herself, with the same quiet precision that has characterized everything she has said today. She wrote, "There were melodies, verses, and ideas written down and tucked away for some unknown future, when I would have the time and attention to finish them. Apparently, that future is now. Apparently, that future is now." 4 words of understatement that contain, if you sit with them long enough, an entire philosophy of creative survival. Not the future she planned. Not the future she would have chosen if choosing had been available to her, but the future that arrived. The one shaped by illness and surgery, and 8 years of adjustment and learning, and the slow, hard work of becoming someone who can live with what she has been given. And inside that future, the music was waiting, tucked away, patient, ready. And then she said something that deserves to be read slowly, because it is the most important thing in the entire statement. More important than the medical disclosures. More important than the announcement of the album. More important even than the starfish. She wrote, "Working on the music gave shape to days that did not always have much shape. It gave me somewhere to go without having to leave the room. It reminded me that illness can change your life without becoming the whole of your life. Illness can change your life without becoming the whole of your life. That is the sentence. That is the one." That is what Carly Simon, at 81, after 8 years of Parkinson's and a cancer surgery, and the long withdrawal from a public life she had inhabited for more than 50 years, decided she needed to say. Not for sympathy, not for the narrative convenience of a comeback story, but because it is true, and because she has spent her entire career saying true things in the most precise language she can find, and this particular truth, earned at this particular cost, was worth saying. The cancer on her face is gone, surgically removed and gone. The Parkinson's is not gone and will not be gone, but it is being managed, navigated, negotiated with, lived alongside. And the album that was built in the middle of all of it, in the shaped days and the shapeless ones, in the hours of clarity and the hours of the starfish and everything in between, that album is called Comes in Waves, and it arrives on the 14th of August, 2026, 3 weeks from today. Think about what that title means. Comes in waves. Think about what waves do. They arrive and they recede. They are powerful, and then they are quiet. They do not ask permission, and they do not apologize, and they do not promise to be gentle. They come when they come. The illness came in waves. The apathy came in waves. The grief, the adjustment, the slow recalibration of a life that had been lived one way for 8 decades and was now being lived another way. All of it came in waves. And the music, apparently, came in waves too. Carly Simon has spent her entire career making art out of the most specific, most personal, most precisely observed details of her own experience, and then watching those specific details become universal, become the thing that millions of people recognize as their own truth, rendered by someone else's gift. You're So Vain is about one person and about every person. Anticipation is about one evening and about every evening. Nobody does it better is about one love and about every love. Comes in Waves will be about one illness, one surgery, one 8-year withdrawal, one woman at 81 finding her way back to the room where she does her best work. And it will be about everyone who has ever had to find their way back to something they thought they might have lost. That is what Carly Simon does. That is what she has always done. That is what she is, at 81, still doing. And the world, which has been waiting, with the patient loyalty of people who love someone enough to wait, is about to hear what those 8 years sounded like from the inside. There is a particular kind of legacy that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a press release or a Lifetime Achievement Award or a retrospective exhibition mounted in a gallery with white walls and careful lighting. It arrives the way the best things always arrive, quietly and in the middle of something else, and only fully visible in retrospect, when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. Carly Simon's legacy arrived a long time ago. It arrived in 1971, when a young woman from New York with a publishing dynasty for a father and a stutter for a childhood, and a voice that sounded like it had already lived several lives, sat down and made anticipation out of 15 minutes of waiting. It arrived in 1972 when You're So Vain entered the culture and never left. It arrived in 1977 when she handed a James Bond film one of the most perfectly constructed pop songs ever written, and the film was better for it. It arrived in 1988 when the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences placed an Oscar in her hands for Let the River Run, a song about ambition and possibility and the particular American hunger to build something that matters. And the room understood, in the way rooms sometimes understand things all at once, that this was not a songwriter receiving an award, but a poet receiving her due. That legacy was already complete before the silence began. What makes today remarkable, what makes the 27th of July, 2026 a date that people who love music will remember, is not that Carly Simon survived. Survival, on its own, is not a legacy. It is not even particularly interesting as a narrative. People survive things every day. What makes today remarkable is what she did with the survival, what she built inside it, what she refused to let the illness take from her, even when the illness was taking a great deal. She built Comes in Waves, an album made in the shaped days and the shapeless ones. An album assembled from melodies written down and tucked away on the days when writing was possible, held in reserve for the days when it was not. An album that carries inside it, in whatever form the music finally took, 8 years of adjustment and grief and humor, and the hard, unglamorous daily work of becoming someone who can live with what has been given to her. An album that will arrive on the 14th of August, 2026, 3 weeks from today. And that will ask its listeners to hear not just the songs, but the silence that preceded them, and to understand that the silence was not empty. The silence was a studio, and she was working. Carly Simon is the only surviving child of 4. Her sister Lucy, composer, Broadway titan, the woman who took the family's musicality and built it into something the theater world will not forget, died of breast cancer in 2023. Her sister Joanna, the soprano, the classical voice, the other half of a sibling musical inheritance so rich it seems almost implausible, died in the same year, the same week, of thyroid cancer. 2 sisters, 1 week, 2023. She has not spoken publicly about those losses today. She did not include them in the statement, and the restraint of that omission is itself a kind of eloquence. The recognition that some griefs are too large and too private to carry into a public announcement, that some losses belong only to the person who sustained them. But anyone reading today's statement, with full knowledge of what the last several years have held for her, understands that the words, the starfish, the lost address book, the all-season bear, the days without shape, carry more weight than even the medical context alone can explain. She has been carrying a great deal, and she has been carrying it, by and large, alone. And she made an album. She wrote, at 81 years of age, with Parkinson's disease and a cancer surgery behind her, and 2 sisters in the ground, and 8 years of public silence finally ending. She wrote, "I have learned to accept that every day will look a little different, but I am still very much here. I am still very much here. Not I am recovered. Not I am cured. Not I am the same person I was before the diagnosis, before the surgery, before the losses, before the long withdrawal from a world that continued turning without her visible presence in it. Simply, I am here. Still. Very much. That is the statement of a woman who has made her peace with impermanence, without surrendering to it, who has looked at the evidence, the tremors, the apathy, the surgical scar, the changed face in the mirror, the 2 empty chairs that used to hold her sisters, and decided that the evidence does not add up to an ending. It adds up to a different kind of continuing, a different tempo, a different relationship with what each day can hold and what it cannot. Every day will look a little different. That sentence, in the context of Parkinson's disease, is a clinical description of something real. The variability of symptoms, the way the condition ebbs and flows, the impossibility of predicting which version of yourself you will wake up to on any given morning. But it is also, in the hands of a writer as precise as Carly Simon, something more than clinical. It is a philosophy, an accommodation with uncertainty that most people spend their entire lives trying and failing to reach, and that she appears to have arrived at not through meditation or therapy, or any of the usual prescribed routes to equanimity, but through the simple, hard, repeated practice of waking up each morning inside a life she did not choose, and finding in it the things worth doing. The music, always the music. Comes in, waves arrives in 3 weeks. We do not yet know what it sounds like. We do not know which collaborators she gathered, which instruments she chose, which melodies from the tucked-away archive made the final record, and which ones are still waiting for a future that has not arrived yet. We do not know whether it sounds like the Carly Simon of 1972, or the Carly Simon of 1988, or something entirely new, something shaped by everything that has happened since the last record, and carrying, in its grooves, the particular texture of a life that has been through what her life has been through, and come out the other side still making art. We will know on the 14th of August. What we know today, what this morning's statement gave us, in language so precise and so personal, and so entirely Carly Simon that there was no question whose words they were, is something more important than a track listing or a release date. We know that the silence was not defeat. We know that the withdrawal was not surrender. We know that an 81-year-old woman with Parkinson's disease looked at the days that did not have much shape and gave them shape, looked at the room she did not have to leave in order to go somewhere, and went there, looked at an illness that had taken a great deal from her, and decided, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has been making music since before most of her audience was born, that it would not take this. Not this. She has not stopped living. She has not stopped working. She is still very much here. If that does not move you, if the image of Carly Simon at 81, with everything she has carried and everything she has lost, and everything her body has asked of her in these 8 years, sitting in a room writing down melodies for an unknown future that turned out to be this August, If that does not move you, then nothing in this story will. But if it does, if you feel, as so many people feel today, reading her words for the first time, that familiar shock of recognition that has always been Carly Simon's greatest gift, the sense that someone has put into language something you knew but could not say, then leave a tribute for her in the comments below. Tell her what her music has meant. Tell her which song. Tell her which summer, which heartbreak, which specific evening her voice arrived and made the thing you were feeling feel less impossible to carry. She has been listening. She is still listening. Because comes in waves. And she is still very much here. Subscribe to Golden Fame News. There are more stories like this one. Stories of extraordinary people who built extraordinary lives and paid the extraordinary cost that extraordinary lives always extract. We tell those stories the way they deserve to be told. With respect. With detail. With the full weight of what they actually were. This has been the story of Carly Simon. And it is not finished yet.